stuff that's on the screen just happens to be what keeps my computer from committing suicide. So. Well, first of all, I want to thank you all very, very much for coming. Can you hear me okay? Good. This particular presentation is called Thinking Like a Watershed. And basically, I'm using the concept of watershed to talk about systems thinking, which does not mean that I won't be talking about water. I got to thinking about this today. The first time I really started thinking about thinking like a watershed, I was sitting on a cliff overlooking the Chapalagana River down in the Sierra Madre Occidental about 50 years ago, and thought, gee whiz, look at that river, and it carved this enormous canyon. And so over the years, I've had quite a bit to do with water. I've run quite a few rivers. I'm sure many of you here know Dutch Salmon and fellow river rat. And I don't know if he's doing it anymore. I'm not. I gave away my boat 10 years ago. I figured I'm probably not up for running the tough ones anymore. But at any rate, who knows? It's not a bad way to go. Anyway, I had the great good fortune in 2000, the year 2000, to produce a 6-part radio series for public radio. There, that's better. Called Moving Waters, the Colorado River in the West. And that entailed my traveling to the headwaters of the San Juan, the Wind, and the Colorado rivers, and getting all the way down to the Delta, where almost no water from the Colorado River was flowing. And I looked at what had happened to that ecosystem down there that used to be so lush. How many here have ever been down to the Sea of Cortez? It's a fabulous place, and it still is, but it could be restored. As a matter of fact, I found a place where a little bit of water was ripping into the Sea of Cortez, and wow, there were birds galore, there were fish galore, but where the actual delta is, it's a dry land and a wasteland. So I got to thinking about that quite a bit. I visited the dams, the Glen Canyon Dam, which is the most contested dam in the United States, and I was very fortunate before 9/11, this was just before 9/11, to have been taken down into the bowels of the Hoover Dam, originally known as the Boulder Dam. And it is amazing, the engineering of that dam. But the more I got to thinking of it, metaphorically, every one of those dams, if you likened a watershed to your own body, which it really is, every one of those dams is like a plugged artery or vein. And it affects the bigger system. And so, more and more, I got to thinking about what watersheds really do mean. And then in 2009, I signed a contract to produce a 1-hour radio program for NPR called Aldo Leopold in the Southwest. And of course, Aldo Leopold is very well known in this region because it was he who brought us the Gila wilderness as the very first wilderness area. And I interviewed an old friend who used to be a Secretary of the Interior, a man named Stuart Udall, who told me the story of how Aldo Leopold, after he had gotten very ill when he was the forest supervisor for the Jicarilla Ranger District up in the northern part of the Carson National Forest, the best job he could get after he got well after 2 years was as a secretary, as a paid secretary for the Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce. This is a man who had gotten his master's degree in forestry from Yale University. But we have to earn a living. And it turned out that he had a friend who was an insurance salesman in Albuquerque, whose name was Clinton Anderson. And Clinton Anderson went on to become a New Mexico senator. And it was because of the friendship between Aldo Leopold and Clinton Anderson that the Gila wilderness became a wilderness area when it did, back in 1924, I think it was. And it was 40 years later, on the watch of Stuart Udall, in 1964. And I listened to this on the radio, and it was great. It's when Lyndon Johnson signed the Wilderness Act. And that was all brought by Aldo Leopold. Well, anyway, the reason I'm getting into this is because Aldo Leopold, in his beautiful book, A Sand County Almanac, had written a beautiful chapter entitled Thinking Like a Mountain, which is a wonderful chapter. But the hard part is, when you look at reality right here at this point in time, thinking like a mountain is running a little bit too slow to take care of what we really need to take care of if this old planet and us are going to survive. And so I got to thinking like a watershed has got a little bit more energy going there. And I love wild rivers, and I love any kind of a river, really. And so I took my inspiration in great measure from my favorite river, which is the San Juan. Has anybody here ever run the San Juan? It's wonderful. It's one of the great rivers. And I've done it now 30 or 40 times, and it's really been a spiritual experience each time. And so I started thinking about that a lot, and at one point, I have a daughter, and she had just graduated with creative writing degree from UNM, the University of New Mexico. So she and I collaborated on this book, Thinking Like a Watershed. And what I'd done for this, and what she did too, and we all did this, is we interviewed a lot of Native American people, we interviewed ranchers, we interviewed people from different cultural persuasions, I guess is the best way to put that. And to try to get everybody's sense of the way they looked culturally at the land. And so tonight, I'm going to play for you a few excerpts from some of the interviews that I've conducted over a long time. I started traveling with a tape recorder back in 1964, it was. I lived in a fork-stick hogan up at Navajo Mountain. And would you believe I turned it on and it didn't work? Anyway. So I'm going to bring up on the screen, if it works, this map. This map was rendered by John Wesley Powell, and it appeared in the 1889-1890 11th Annual Report to from the USGS to the Secretary of the Interior. And this map is the watersheds of the arid West. That red line, let's see, I pushed the green button. That's it. Zap, zap, zap. Anyway. That red line right there is the 100th meridian. And some of you may be familiar with Wallace Stegner's book, Beyond the 100th Meridian, which is very much about this whole dry region. And what you see there, the different bold colors, and you see also different shadings within those colors, represent the 150 or so watersheds that John Wesley Powell was able to identify as he rode by horseback. Now, probably many of you know that John Wesley Powell had been a major in the Union Army during the Civil War, and he had his right arm basically shot off with a mini ball musket wound at the Battle of Shiloh. And so there was John Wesley Powell with no right arm from the elbow down. And at home I've got a picture of him riding his horse, talking to, I think it's a Paiute Indian. And he didn't have a gun on his belt, nor did he have a rifle in the rifle scabbard. And so I make a very bad joke about how John Wesley Powell rode through hostile Indian country unarmed. Sorry. Just can't help it. Anyway, we are here, right in there. The Gila River watershed is a fascinating watershed, as many of you know a lot better than I, but two people whom I'm sure most of you know, not all of you, are Donna Stevens and Allison Civic, who do the Gila Watershed Alliance. And they have been working like mad to protect the Gila River watershed. And they would have been here tonight, except they're up in Santa Fe, vigorously working out before the state legislature in behalf of the Gila River. And so that's where they are. But I've been invited by them a few times now to come down and speak in behalf of the watersheds. But what I'd like to really say here, I'll look at my notes. As I mentioned earlier, the purpose of this is to look at watersheds as a metaphor for a bigger system. Systems thinking is something we've gravely overlooked. We've been so trained in reductionist thinking, because that has been a pinnacle of science, is to look at the lowest common denominator, that we've rarely been trained to look at the bigger picture. And I have a book by my friend Fritjof Capra entitled The Web of Life. And I really highly recommend that book because it really gets into systems thinking. But the upshot is that I'm going to play you an excerpt right now. Does the poet Gary Snyder ring a bell? I interviewed Gary. Well, Gary's a great friend. We've actually run both Desolation Canyon and the San Juan River together and had a lot of fun. Actually, we were both together as housemates at the first UN Conference on the Human Environment back in 1972 over in Stockholm. And that was an interesting moment in time. But the upshot was that over the years, Gary and I have become good friends and done a lot of work together. And he had a really interesting thing to say about his perspective concerning watersheds.
Watersheds are obvious concepts to think in terms of. They have unarguable boundaries, and they're easy to map. They're a very clear entity in the phenomenal world. A lot of watershed thinking is very professional, scientific, organized and led by government agencies in many cases, and the territory of hydrologists and GIS mappers, soil scientists, fisheries people, and so forth. But there is another side that actually goes back several decades, which is the community watershed consciousness, where people became engaged with their watershed regions as part of re-inhabitation, of becoming members of a place, or part of a decision to become a people who live somewhere and who takes responsibility for a place as members of that community. And that is the cultural side of what we call bioregionalism. And that has brought about watershed groups and watershed consciousness, which is not simply measuring the rate of flow or testing pollution, but is writing poems, painting pictures, taking photographs, telling tales, watershed art, and watershed celebrations, like Lewis McAdams and his friends on the Los Angeles River, started before anything else with a river celebration for the LA River. And everybody thought they were nuts. Celebrate that old ditch. Lewis said, we got to start somewhere. Let's do a dance and read poems to cheer it up. That's actually how it started, to cheer the river up. If one is a professional, you're thinking about it like E.O. Wilson thinks about life in a way. If you're a community member, all of the qualities of the region, including its beauty and its integrity, are part of what concern you. And you don't measure the watershed simply in nuts and bolts terms of biological diversity and soil quality or water purity, but in something that is subtler and deeper, which is how does it feel and how is life doing here? How are things all getting along with each other? What kind of a dance is this? How is the song going? How is the music rising from it? How do we feel when we walk the ridge or go down the river? Insights and feelings that come out of that are expressed in the arts. They're also expressed in architecture. They're expressed in the designs you put on your shirt and the kinds of sandals you wear. They enter in ways that we can't even quite trace. They enter into the life of a place and the people who live in the place. That's true.
Gary's a pretty smart guy, I'll tell you. I regard him as one of our most profound living environmental thinkers. I've been very honored to befriend some very interesting environmental thinkers over the years, and Gary's right up there. He'll be speaking later in this. Is anybody here familiar with an essay that came out in 1968 that was written by Garrett Hardin entitled The Tragedy of the Commons? It's an amazing essay, it really is. And part of what I want to bring together here is thinking in terms of watersheds as commons, as well as several other things. But in 1984, December 1984, Ed Abbey and I were hiking through the Sonoran Desert one day, and he said, "Have you ever read anything by Garrett Hardin?" I said, "Yeah, I read The Tragedy of the Commons." And he said, "Have you read his most current essay, An Ecolate View of the Human Predicament?" It was in Scientific American. And I said, "No, I haven't." And so Ed lent me his copy of that Scientific American, which I took with me and I never returned, but that's okay. He didn't return some of the books I lent him either. But at any rate, it turned out that about 5 days later, I happened to be in California, in Santa Barbara, where I knew that Garrett Hardin had been a professor of human ecology at the University of Cal in Santa Barbara. So I called him up. I found him in the phone book. I called him up and I said, "My name is Jack Loeffler, and if you're amenable, I would love to interview you for a radio series I'm producing." And he said, "Yes, I'd be very happy to be interviewed." And I said, "When?" And he said, "Now." And so I said, "Well, how do I get to your house?" And he gave me directions up to Gila, where he lived. And so there I was, driving my car on Route 101 in California, speed reading An Ecolate View of the Human Predicament. And I survived. At any rate, I got over to Dr. Hardin's house, and he's really a good man. Actually, I'm going to play for you a little bit about how he considered the notion of the tragedy of the commons, bearing in mind that this essay came out 51 years ago. That kind of blows my mind when you think about it. Anyway, this is Garrett Hardin.
I took as the example the historical instance of common pasture lands in England, which were called commons, and pointed out that those worked very well, probably for hundreds of years. And then along toward the 17th and 18th centuries, people became aware of the fact that something was wrong, that they were being overgrazed, and consequently they were going downhill. And the basic reason was that when people have access to common lands on the basis of their need as they perceive it, and when the population grows to the point where the number of people exceeds the carrying capacity of the land, or the number of cows exceeds the carrying capacity of the pasture, then each person seeking his own self-interest will put the number of cattle he wants to on the common pasture land. The result is that presently there are too many, and the whole thing is destroyed. Now, the reason this is a tragedy is because even after each individual realizes what is happening, he is powerless to stop it, because he says, well, if I don't get it, the pigs will. In other words, my neighbors who are pigs will get it. So I'll take mine before these pigs get there. Well, each neighbor reasons in the same way. And so although there's complete knowledge of what's happening, the deterioration is inevitable. So this is like a Greek tragedy where knowledge doesn't prevent the unfortunate end. Now, there is an escape from this, of course, and that is to get rid of the commons. And then you have two possibilities. Either you can turn it into private property, as was done in England, unjustly, I may say, the way it was done, but at least this will save the pasture land. Or you can turn it into public property, and then you have to appoint managers. And then you're at the mercy of the managers. If they manage well, it's fine, but if they don't, it isn't good. So there's no simple answer as to which one of the other systems will work better, private property, privatism, or socialism. Either one may work, or either one may not work. But the one clear thing is that the commons cannot possibly work once the population has grown too great.
When he wrote that essay, the human population of the planet was less than half of what it is now. 50 years. Well, I've listened to this and I've really read the transcription of this, and actually went back and visited Garrett Hardin on different occasions because we became friends. We used to sit out in the backyard and eat strawberries. He'd had polio as a kid and was restricted to a wheelchair. And he loved to have company and people who were fun to talk with. And so we had a really good time doing that. But the more I've reflected on what he just said there, the more I've realized that he was looking at the commons from solely a human perspective. He wasn't looking at it from the perspective of a deer or a coyote or a wasp or a bird. And so I got to thinking about, what does this mean on the bigger level? How do you think about it more systemically? Well, I've had the great opportunity to meet and befriend many, many Native American people over the years. People from different cultural persuasions throughout the American West and Mexico and beyond, actually. Back in 1975, I had a really far out gig with the Smithsonian. I was asked to be the sound ethnomusicologist guy for an expedition to the Cook Islands to record Maori creation myths from all over the South Pacific. And that was an amazing time. It was there that I really got to thinking about, what does the mythic process really mean? But that's another conversation. But the upshot is that I've had the great good fortune to meet, well, actually one of my great friends in this lifetime, who passed away a little over 3 years ago, was a woman from the Santa Clara Pueblo, born into the Santa Clara Pueblo, who went on to get 3 degrees, a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD, in order to be able to debate with people from monoculture about reality. Her name was Rena Swensel, and she was one of the most amazing people I've ever known in my life. And well, back in the 80s, she had called me up one day. I'd never met her at that point. And she asked me if I'd be up for coming out to the Pueblo, Santa Clara Pueblo, and recording her mother singing Tewa children's songs. And I was totally honored. I had to smuggle my recorder into the Pueblo, which I've done many a time at this point, but always at the request of the Tewa Indians or any of the Indians. But at any rate, one day I had my tape recorder out there and I asked Rena Swensel, if she could give me her sense of what the commons really means. Here she
From
is.
a Pueblo point of view, the commons is everything. It is the context that we live in. The community was always thought of as being a whole. Everything was interconnected. And there was always a center to it as well. And I was a center, you were a center. There were many centers as a part of the whole thing. With the Pueblo, there are so many simultaneous things that can happen at once, which is all part of the commons, I think. There are so many things that go on at the same time. The wind is blowing, the water's flowing, and we're actually walking around and talking, and it's all part of what we all share. In that Pueblo context, then, the focus was always, what is it that surrounds me all the time? But the primary thing is that we felt that it was the earth, the sky, the clouds, the wind, and that incredible term that we have, for me, says it all. It's the po, wan, the water, wind, breath. That connects, it moves through our entire world in such a way that it connects everybody and everything. That becomes the commons. In the Pueblo, it really was that thing that swirls around, that blows, that moves, that creates a sense of commons. It's the ultimate of what is common to every living being. With the trees, with the rocks, with all of that, that makes our life what it is today.
That to me is one of the most beautiful definitions of how to look at the flow of nature that I've ever heard. I've been fortunate to have recorded many people from different cultural persuasions from as far north as Idaho down into Chiapas on this continent. And I've met many traditional indigenous people and people who are still indigenous within the context of their cultural perspective. Every single one of them regards the land as sacred. And our culture, unfortunately, has specialized in secularizing habitat in order to turn it into money. And this is, to me, the great tragedy of our time. It's something that we're going to have to address. Well, we are addressing it in certain ways, but we're not addressing it fast enough or with a big enough mind at this point. I have a good friend named Gerrymander, not to be confused with the political upheaval. He really does exist. I kid him about his hypothetical sister, Sally. Terrible. Anyway, Jerry wrote a book, a very well-received book, some 35 years ago now. Excuse me, getting over whatever it was. The name of that book was 4 Reasons for the Elimination of Television. And maybe some of you have been made aware of that book. It's a great book. And then in 2013, Jerry came out with a book that really blew my mind. It's called The Capitalism Papers, or The Capitalist Papers, Fatal Flaws of an Obsolete System. And that book came out, and I called him up. And he lives in Bolinas. And I said, Jerry, I really want to interview you about this book. And there are a bunch of things that I could play for you, but I'm going to play this one thing about Jerry's sense of the corporate perspective. He did bring up in this that in July 1944, which was near the end of World War II, representatives of the 90 nations that comprised the Allies who were fighting the Axis. The Axis in those days were comprised of Germany, Japan, and Italy. 90 members met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and devised the whole scheme as to what would become the World Bank and the global economy. That occurred absolutely in conjunction with the introduction of television to the American public. And Jerry pointed out, he himself had been trained as an ad man, a Madison Avenue ad man. And he is 6 weeks older than I am, which makes him 82 and a half. And he pointed out that it was the result of that, in conjunction with television, that established the whole corporate takeover of the commons of human consciousness. That's the way I see it. I see human consciousness itself as a commons. It really is when you think about it. We are all privy to cultural perspectives that sort of meld, and some cultural perspectives are more powerful than others. And the corporate perspective is very powerful in today's culture. So I'm going to play you a minute or so of Jerry talking about part of his perspective with regard to the corporate mentality, gerrymander.
Greed, often people say, define capitalism in terms of greed. And I try to make a distinction there. It's not individual greed at all. It's really systemic greed. The system has to make its decisions based upon what's best for the structure of capitalism, for the structure of the corporation. Because if they don't do that, then their investors and their shareholders and their bosses on the board and so on will fire them. You won't be able to keep your job if you don't make your decision like that. You have to make the decision based on cold, unfeeling, amoral, meaning without moral consideration, on what's going to serve growth and financial interests. And that's built into the system. That's part of the structure of the system, period. So that's why it can just throw off one guy. You don't do it, they throw you out, they get another guy who will do it. That's inherent in the system.
That's a pretty interesting thought. And that system has come to prevail over a whole bunch of our cultural consciousness in this time. I am old enough to really remember growing up. I remember aspects, believe it or not, of the Great Depression. I was born in Parkersburg, West Virginia, on the banks of the Ohio River in 1936. And I'm convinced that that's where my interest in watersheds began, because I think they threw my placenta in the Ohio River. And so it sort of dissolved. Anyway, I remember elements of the Great Depression. I remember seeing people living on houseboats on the Ohio River, fishing for catfish, and if they didn't catch any, they didn't eat. And then I remember at the age of 5.5 actually, hearing about how the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. By this time, Germany and England were at war in Europe, but this was what ensconced us in World War II. And that became a huge event from my childhood on until I was about 9 in 1945 with the end of the war. And shortly thereafter, television happened, and a whole new perspective focused solely on consumerism happened. And smoking cigarettes. I remember seeing people dressed up like old gold cigarettes dancing across the black and white television screen. Anybody here besides me remember that? Yeah. Wow, what a time. But at any rate, that prevails to this very day. I watch one football game a year, mainly to find out what the advertising is and seeing where we are in America at this moment in time. And it's fascinating because we're still at it, trying to lure people into buying stuff. Because if you buy stuff, it makes the whole economic system work. And yet, the economic system is based on growth for the sake of growth. And as my great friend in this lifetime, Edward Abbey, said, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell, which I think is right on. Well, I'm going to shift into a slightly different aspect of the paradigm right now. I mentioned earlier on Fritjof Capra having written this book, which came out in '95. It's entitled The Web of Life. For those of you who may remember Fritjof, he had written The Tao of Physics that came out in 1975, which was very successful. And I somehow happened to meet him at my house in Santa Fe in 1989. He'd come by. And I met him and discovered that he probably has the most evolved intellect of anybody I've ever met. An amazing mind. He was trained, he got his PhD in quantum physics in Austria or Bavaria, one of those German language places. He speaks with a hefty German accent. Here is this man trained in quantum physics, which is a pretty interesting field unto its own. And he realized that biology and ecology were the subjects that really need to be studied and understood. And so he shifted his scientific emphasis and over the years became a world-class biologist and ecologist. His most recent book, which I have at home and I waded through twice, it's a pretty hefty book, heavy. Not easy reading, but it's worth it. And it's entitled A System's View of Life, a Unifying Vision. Boy, I'm sorry about the frog in the throat, but at any rate, I read that book. I'd seen it advertised or reviewed, actually, in the New Scientist, which is the only magazine to which I subscribe. Being a non-scientist, it's good to try to get a little science in my noggin. I started out as a jazz musician, so that wasn't too close to science. And but I did get straight A's in astronomy in college, which I thought was pretty cool. Anyway, oops. I called up Fritjof after I read his book, and he agreed for me to come out. I flew out to Berkeley. Actually, I flew to Oakland, rented a car, and drove through that traffic. And from northern New Mexico to Oakland in 2 hours is like lodging oneself in utter chaos. And I realized at my age I had no business doing that anymore. I'll kill somebody, and myself included. But I have to play this piece from Fritjof Capra. He's here talking about thinking in terms of biological systems. And after I play what I'll play of his, I'll try to elaborate a little bit to clarify it. But I highly recommend reading Fritjof's work. It's just brilliantly written and brilliantly conceived. So here's Fritjof Capra.
My latest book, called The System's View of Life, refers to a conceptual revolution which is related to the conceptual revolution in physics, but occurred in the life sciences, where people have...
I'm sorry. I recorded that in 1977. And that became the theme song for 149 radio shows that I produced called La Música de los Viejitos. I didn't bring that book, but that was another lifetime. So we'll get back to Fritjof here, or try to. I don't know how that happened. It's all a mystery. I don't have an iPhone or one of those things. I just struggle along, Luddite that I am. Okay, Fritjof, we try again.
My latest book, called The System's View of Life, refers to a conceptual revolution which is related to the conceptual revolution in physics, but occurred in the life sciences, where people have also discovered that you cannot represent or think of living organisms as machines composed of elementary building blocks, but have to see them as inseparable networks of relationships. We have also discovered that the planet as a whole is a living, self-regulating, self-organizing system. Accordingly, the human body as a machine and the mind as a separate entity have given way to a conception that sees not only the brain, but also the immune system, the bodily organs and tissues, in fact, every single cell, as a living cognitive system. So cognition and life have become intimately connected. Evolution is no longer seen as a competitive struggle for existence, but rather as a cooperative dance in which creativity and the constant emergence of novelty are the driving forces. And with the strong emphasis on complexity in the recent 2 decades, on networks, on patterns of organization, a whole new science of qualities is beginning to emerge. The best we can do is to learn from the wisdom of nature, because the wisdom of nature is not just a beautiful metaphor, but it's actual wisdom that is millions and billions of years old. And evolution, although not having a plan and a strategy, but nevertheless evolution has been able to tinker with various solutions to its problems, and over billions of years has found the best solutions. And so this whole new movement of eco-design, of deriving design principles from ecology, from the basic principles of ecology that we observe in nature, and the practice of biomimicry, of mimicking the solutions that nature has found, is something very important. Well, indigenous cultures have had this approach for centuries, gleaning things from nature, copying things from nature, and living in harmony with nature and cooperating with nature. As far as I know, many of these indigenous traditions have this concept of reciprocity.
And that's true. This is something I'm going to, it turns out that writing books is a heck of a good way to think. And in order to clarify my own thinking has resulted in having put together books. And so I sort of talk to myself. That's what it's all about. But the upshot is that Fritjof is right on the mark. The closer you get to thinking in terms of living systems, of living cells, he talks about, he took a great cue from 2 guys down in Chile. One was named Humberto Maturana, and the other one was Francisco Varela. Dr. Varela passed away several years ago, but Dr. Maturana is still around, and I'd sure love to meet him. But he was the one who has pointed out that life and cognition are 2 aspects of the same phenomenon. And you can take it all the way back to the cellular level. And so in my imagination, one of the things that I just really got off on thinking about, first of all, according to the tome of science, the universe popped into being some 13.8 billion years ago. The solar system sort of began to formulate about 4.54 billion years ago. And shortly thereafter, the Earth formed. And then about 3.8 billion years ago, 3.8 billion years ago, that's 3.8 thousand million years ago, LUCA happened. LUCA is the acronym for the last universal common ancestor. It was not the first living cell, but it was the one from which all life today is descended. Also according to the tome of science, but there's more and more. In other words, each of us in this room have 355 or so genes that were present in LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, which ostensibly was born near a hydrothermal vent in whatever kind of a sea was present back in those days. But just think about that. Life has been here on this planet for 3.8 plus billion years ago. And that last universal common ancestor, Luca for short, which didn't even have a nucleus, by the way. It was what I think they call a prokaryotic cell, didn't have a nucleus, as opposed to a eukaryotic cell, which does, and is also powered by mitochondria, which brings me up to what I do every morning. It's pretty cold up in Santa Fe, so in the middle of winter, I still go. The first thing I do after I get up is I splash handfuls of cold water onto my face, and I yell, mitochondria, mitochondria, because it's powering me. Anyway, back to Luca. It's interesting to me to know that of all of the billions of forms of life, or millions at least, many, many millions, and perhaps billions of forms of life that have existed on this planet, each of us has been related to Luca, that first cell from 3.8 billion years ago. In other words, we're all interconnected. We are not separate from any living cell that has ever existed on this planet. As a matter of fact, we have different species of cells right in our own guts, which is an interesting thought. There are whole communities of life running around in our bodies that are not us, and yet they are. They're what really make us tick. I don't know as much about that as I'd like to, and that's one of the many things I want to learn more about. Stuart Brand, the guy who brought us the Whole Earth Catalog, remember that, anybody? Stuart is a futurist, and Gary Snyder and I went out and interviewed Stuart about 10 years ago. Stuart's an old pal. We used to be business partners of all things back in 1963. But Stuart pointed out that, well, he is friends with a guy named Craig Venter. Craig Venter was one of the two people who came up with the human genome. According to Stuart, Craig Venter was the first person to have accomplished it. And thereafter climbed on his sailboat, I think called the Sorcerer II, and started sailing around the world. And he had devised this method called shotgunning. And he would stick his shotgunning device into the seas and bring up water. He would isolate the precise spot on a map where he got the stuff, send it back to Baltimore to the laboratory. And in something like 4 or 5 months, he had discovered 3 to 4 million new genes, heretofore unknown. And all of it is related. It's all related. We are. Robinson Jeffers, who's one of my favorite poets, in one of his poems said something to the effect that we must not see ourselves apart, not man apart from the rest of life. And Dave Brower was so impressed with that that became the publication for Friends of the Earth, which is I don't know. Dave got fired. He was a good guy too. Dave Brower was no slouch. We used to go backpacking. He was the first guy to climb Shiprock. And boy, that had to be it. One night we camped at the base, Dave and I camped at the base of Shiprock. And he showed me the way up, and I thought, boy, you're a better man than I. Anyway, as Fritjof was saying, indigenous cultures, traditional cultures, intuitively understand this relationship, this natural interconnectedness. They intuit the system's understanding that the whole thing is a big system. I'm going to play you a short excerpt from this amazing thinker. She's a lady from Hopi country, named Loris Taylor. And I'm going to play a little bit of her talking about her sense of the spirit of place.
In Hopi, we are taught that the trees are alive, the rocks are alive. There are things that are tangible and intangible elements or things that are alive in this universe. And the continuum of human life expands over into other planes, so that the spirit of a place is not just physical, it's intangible. It's the spirit of the people that once occupied those centers. It's the spirit of the trees and the rocks that make up the center. And then it's also the belief system that we have that the spirits are there, that the deities are there, that the Gazinas reside there, these spiritual beings that still visit us today, that they reside in those places. So when you go to visit Aztec or Chaco, you will find Hopi individuals carrying their pouch of cornmeal, because that's how much reverence that place has. The combination of all those elements, the rocks and the trees and the spirits that occupy it, from the Gazinas to the deities that visited that place who are still there, because there's a continuum of life that never ends. It's into eternity, it's forever, it's in perpetuity. And that's the connection that we have. It's a live place. Some people see them only as places where there are mounds of rocks, or maybe they see the rock art, and that's all they see. It's a very limited perspective. From the Hopi perspective, it's beyond that. It's much more complicated and more complex in nature. It's just a whole different thought process that occurs.
She's a very talented thinker herself. And it's interesting to me, I mean, when I look at these watersheds that you see on the map here, I've had the great good fortune to visit most of them and record sounds of habitat in quite a few of them. And when you record something and you listen back to it, it takes you right there. It's one of the most remarkable mnemonic devices. Actually, I think a man named Walter Ong and also a man named Edward O. Wilson both said to me that they considered hearing the most deeply penetrating of the five senses. And I really think that's true. I'm going to have to play something here. I recorded this in the Sonoran Desert many years ago. It was near a spring. Isn't that nice? It really is wonderful to go to sleep listening to that. I've got a huge archive full of recordings like that. Because we're talking about, or sort of talking about watersheds, here's another one. That's the San Juan River. I love that river. Oh, what a great river. Anyway, I want to touch on one of the things that I think we really have to think more and more about. And I know that people around here are very conscious of the necessity for restoration ecology. The first time I really got into thinking about that was when I mentioned earlier that Estella Leopold, she is the youngest of the 5 offspring of Aldo Leopold and his wife Estella Berger Leopold, who was part of the Luna family in New Mexico, Hispano. And at one point, Estella Leopold, I mentioned this earlier, came by the house and I recorded her playing the Leopold family repertoire of Hispano folk songs, and that was really cool, really was. But she was is emerita in paleobotany. She's still with us. She's 88 or 9 at this point. But she told me about how she and her mother and father and brothers and sister would go to the shack in Sand County and start restoring the habitat to the way Aldo conceived that it probably had been prior to having been overfarmed and wiped out. And so from her point of view, that was the beginning of restoration ecology within the context of our current culture. This was back in the 30s. She was a young lady at that point, and she really is one of the most amazing people I've ever known. I like her a lot. But just thinking about restoration ecology, I have a great friend to whom I'm the godfather of her 2 kids, named Melissa Savage, who lives in Santa Fe and got her PhD in biogeography, which is truly one of the coolest subjects you could possibly get a PhD in if you were so inclined, because it is systems thinking. And it's one of the first real graduate degrees to have come along. It's only been around as a degree, I think, in the last 25 or 30 years. But it's the first time that in that particular degree, it is systems thinking rather than the reductionist thinking that we're trained normally to think in terms of reducing things to the bottom line rather than looking at all of the elements of the bigger picture. And so I've tried to open my mind to that concept rather than wrap my mind around it, because wrapping my mind around it would be trying to reduce it, and opening my mind to it, at least I try. Anyway, because it's a tough thing. I'm, having been born into the culture into which we were all born, none of us has escaped having been trained to think in the reductionist way, which is basically Cartesian, Newtonian, etc. And it's one way of looking at reality, but another way is looking at all of the interrelated, the bigger picture of things. As an aside here, one of the thoughts that really comes to mind all the time to me, up until about a year and a half ago, cosmologists and astronomers thought there were perhaps as many as 2 billion galaxies in the known universe. 2 billion galaxies. But they've upped the ante to more like 2 trillion galaxies, which is somewhere between 15 and 20 galaxies for every human that's ever lived on the planet. That's the way my weird mind works. When you think about it, though, it just boggles the mind. I mean, our galaxy has somewhere between 100 and 200 billion stars. And so just think about that. I mean, we, in our human form, sit halfway between the micro and the macro. And we can't go much beyond where we have already gone in either direction, according to Fritjof. It's now within the context of micro and quantum physics, where it's no longer matter, it's all waves when you get into that micro element. and that gets to be a bit of a trip. But at any rate, I'm going to play only a couple more things. I have a terrible habit of going way over my allotted time, but I want to play a little bit of Melissa and then one or two other things. But this is Melissa Savage talking about restoration ecology, restoration habitat.
There's been a lot of work in restoration between the Canadian and the Colorado, and indeed in the West, but especially in the Southwest. It's been a kind of leader in restoration. There's been a lot of attention focused on things like forests, forest health, and the role of fire. And I've been involved in a lot of forest restoration, which is important because forests are such a huge habitat. There are, 8 million acres of ponderosa pine in the Southwest, in the Colorado Plateau, and another 7 or 8 million of Canadian juniper. The main focus of restoration now, fortunately, I think has moved toward a recognition that human understanding is fairly inadequate and human efforts are pretty puny in trying to do something like restoring really complex ecosystems. But what we do have a handle on is what kinds of processes were native to these ecosystems. And so what we're trying to do is define the envelope of natural processes and try to push ecosystems to be within that envelope. And so then the natural world can take over and restore itself in a way, heal itself.
I guess it was 19...
That's the whole thing. I mean, where I live, I have about 12 acres. I don't have it. It has me, basically. You can't own the land. You may, within the context of today's cultural perspective, own the right to live on a piece of land. And I know that my neighbors are really bummed out at me because I've got cholla cactus growing on my land, and they all have horses. But the land has its own mind, and I'm watching the land restore itself from having been overgrazed for 100 years. And this is fascinating to me, and it's going through, I've lived there for almost 25 years, and so I've watched it go through its own permutations, and I've watched the species come and go, different ones there, and it's fascinating to watch the habitat restore itself. I'm going to play two more things. I want to play Gary Snyder again. It was 1985, and I was visiting Gary at his place on the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada. And he and I are both old beatniks. He was doing his poetry thing in North Beach while I was playing jazz there back in the 50s. And it was an amazing time, it really was. And I've watched a lot of the counterculture evolve over, since then, 60 years worth of counterculture. Actually, we just did an exhibition at the History Museum up in Santa Fe on the history of counterculture in the Southwest. And I also produced an 8-part radio series, which I'll get to use later, on the history of counterculture on the West Coast and the Southwest. Listening to Alan Reed Howell for the first time, it was really a trip. But at any rate, Gary has taken a huge cue from indigenous cultures throughout California, where he grew up, and he's visited a lot of different indigenous cultures around the world. And then around the late 60s, early 70s, a concept kind of popped into countercultural consciousness, and it's regarded as bioregionalism. How many have heard that word? Okay, I recorded Gary giving his definition of bioregionalism. This was back in 1985, July 1985, the night before we had cooked out over a campfire outside his house. And thereafter we had drunk a bottle of Pernod. And so I, for one, was not at my best. It's a terrible thing to drink, it really is. But at any rate, Gary had the chops to give me this definition of bioregionalism.
bioregionalism is a kind of creative branch of the anarchist, and on the other side, a creative branch of the environmental movement that strives to re-achieve indigeneity, re-achieve aboriginality by learning about the place and what really goes on there. And bioregionalism goes beyond simple geography or biology by its cultural concern, its human concern, as well as its sort of natural history, scientific type concern. Its cultural concern is to not only know the plants and animals of a place, but to know the cultural information of how have people then lived there who knew how to do it. Thus the interest in, say, American Indians, that kind of ethnicity. And then knowing what the deeper mythic, spiritual, archetypal implications of Douglas fir or coyote or blue jay might be, to know from both inside and outside what the total implications of being in place are. So it becomes a study not only of place, but a study of psyche in place. And that's what makes it so interesting. It's in a way, it seems to me, the first truly concrete step that has been taken since Kropotkin in stating how we decentralize ourselves after the 20th century.
And that brings up another hour's conversation, but I won't keep you, but it has to do with decentralization of bureaucracy, decentralization of political power, and community bioregionalism, where we actually take charge of where we live and try to make sure that it doesn't get trashed. So I'm going to close with my friend Camila Lopez, a Tohono O'odham elder, and one of the great lore masters to me, a wonderful thinker. And here he talks about the mirror of nature. That wasn't there.
It's everything. It's the stars. It's the ground under, way under. It's the little ant that comes across. It's the coyote. It's the buzzard. It reflects who you are. If you can see yourself in it, then you're there. But if you can't look at nature and see yourself in it, then you're too far away. And one of the things people need to do is go out and look at the mirror of nature and try to see themselves in it. Because if they can see themselves in it, then they can help themselves by helping the environment.
The main.
There's a key phrase in there. If you look at nature and cannot see yourselves in it, you are too far away. And I think that pretty well says it all. And I'm way over my time already, so I will shut up. But I want to thank you all for coming. If anybody has any questions or comments or want to shoot the breeze, feel free. But thank you. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate your
questions,
coming.
comments.
Yes?
What is the role of spirituality with all this?
The role of spirituality is a very big aspect of all of this, because nature, in essence, really reflects the spirit, period, life in the spirit. I'm going to give you another answer. I'm going to play Ed Abbey.
I think I would regard the invention of monotheism and otherworldly God as a great setback for human life, maybe worse than the invention of agriculture. Once we took the gods out of nature, out of the hills and the forests around us, and made all those little gods into one great God way up in the sky somewhere in outer space, about then human beings, particularly us Europeans, began to devalue the earth we live on and focus our attention on transcendental values, a transcendental deity, which led to a corresponding contempt for nature and the world which feeds us and supports our lives. From that point of view, I think the Indians and most traditional cultures had a much wiser worldview in that they invested every aspect of the world around them, all of nature, animal life, plant life, the landscape itself, with gods, with deity. In other words, everything was divine in some way or other. Probably a much wiser way of life, much more capable of surviving over long periods of time. The American Indian culture apparently lasted at least 20,000 years here in North America before the Europeans largely destroyed it. And although it supported only a relatively small population, maybe 5 million, maybe 10 million, nobody really knows, it lasted for a long time. While European, American, Japanese industrial culture is now about 200 years old, maybe 300, is supporting huge populations, billions. It seems doubtful that it can survive for very long, maybe another century or two, unless there's a drastic change in our way of life. Or unless, as I said before, we solve all the problems by submitting to some sort of technological rationalization of everything, which probably includes the expansion of the industrial system onto the moon and the rest of the galaxy and God knows where.
Ed said it. I mean, when you think about secularizing nature, you're taking the spirit of nature out of it within the context of your own thinking, which means you're taking yourself out of a spiritual perspective. Or one's taking oneself away. To me, when I'm out in it, I feel more deeply spiritual than at any other time. Ed and I used to camp 6 or 7 times a year for up to a couple of weeks at a crack. And we finally concluded that it took both of us, it took us about 10 days to get into that state of mind where you actually feel the sense of the spiritual totally. You become part of it to that extent. And to me, the spirit of nature, it's everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. And to try to define the kind of intelligence that it has is far beyond the ken of the human mind. We just haven't evolved that far. But I don't know, I feel that I'm a very spiritual person. And where I go to commune is out in it. I don't need anything else. It's interesting, one time Ed and I were hiking down near the Straits of Hell, the Stretcho de Infierno, anyway, I can't say it. Anyway, down in the Sea of Cortez. And he asked me if I considered myself a mystic. And I told him probably no more than himself. And after he died, I had to write a book about him. He'd asked me to be his chronicler. So I interviewed his philosophy professor. He got a master's degree in philosophy at UNM, which he said is absolutely worthless. Because what can you do with a degree in philosophy? But what he did with a degree in philosophy was terrific. But the guy he got his primary philosophy professor was a man named Archie Bahm, B-A-H-M. And this was revealed to me years after I had bought this little book called Nature and Intelligence, which was Archie Bahm's interpretation of the Tao Te Ching, which Ed told me was the most perfect little book ever written. So in a sense, he was very much a Taoist, and both of us, I mean, we talked about this a lot, but we regarded ourselves as naturists. That's it. Back in the day, naturists were people who were nudists. But I think there's a bigger picture there. And to become a naturist is to affiliate spiritually with the flow of nature and take every cue we can. It's a very spiritual thing to me, it really is. And thinking like a watershed is my metaphor for trying to open myself up to all of that stuff, from the macro to the micro, to everything in between, to all of these different perspectives. But to think about a single cell named Luca, we've given it that name. To think that we're all related to that, and to wonder where that came from, wonder where the universe came from, and talking to some of the cosmologists that I met up in Santa Fe, at the Santa Fe Institute, who are telling me that in all likelihood, ours is one of an infinite number of universes. Phew. And thus the mind is boggled. But at any rate, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I wonder if you might be so kind to riff a little more on this idea of human consciousness as a commons. That's a really fascinating idea to me. And, you know, to think of it as a resource is probably in itself reductionist, but then to think about how we're squandering human consciousness right now in the dumbing down of us.
That to me is the pultrification of consciousness is a travesty. It dawned on me big time. It's a gradual thing for me, how this came to my mind. But when you think about a cultural perspective, such as we have within the context of our monocultural perspective here in America, that cultural perspective is a commons unto its own. And the indigenous mindedness has been quelled over the centuries with the advent of the Europeans coming to the New World. But they had, it's interesting to me because the pockets of indigenous peoples that I've gotten to know over many years, over 50 years at this point, their collective consciousness, their commons of consciousness is dissimilar to ours. Like I said earlier, they would never secularize habitat to turn it into something like money. And so what I see is that human knowledge itself could be regarded, or a human perspective on all fronts could be regarded as a commons, just like a watershed is a commons. And when we look at that map, and looking at all of these different watersheds, each of them is an element of the commons. And so that is my metaphor for the commons of human consciousness. Each one of those colors represents a different cultural perspective. But if you look at the entire map, that brings together a whole bunch of commons. As my friend Melissa Savage points out, the entire planet is a bioregion. And the entirety of humanity has a commons of consciousness. And some corners of that are not available to us thinking-wise. One of the things that I know, this is a trip for me, boy, I'll tell you. Rena Swensel and her sister Tessie, and Rena's grandson Porter, I'm so sorry here, but and then her brother Tito Naranjo at the Santa Clara Pueblo wrote the Tewa English Dictionary, and then they honored me by asking me to record Tessie reading it in both English and Tewa. And then that is solely for the Tewa-speaking people, so that that level of consciousness, but what I learned in a very profound way is that the only way you can understand the Tewa way of thinking, the Tewa cultural consciousness, is through that language. And that was very profound. Wow, one of the most profound. That was about 5 years ago. And I'm still digesting that, and that contributed to it. Also, when I talked to Gerrymander about what happened back in post-World War II with corporate takeover of the commons of American consciousness, it's a hostile takeover, just as though there's been a hostile takeover of habitat. It wasn't intended as hostile. It was intended to foster growth for the sake of growth and fill the coffers of the corporate structure at great expense not just to habitat, but to the human spirit and to human consciousness. And so one of the things I'm working on, and I just didn't have time to talk about it, I was supposed to talk for an hour, and it's now an hour and a half into it. But I wanted to talk about what I think of as indigenous mindedness, which is achieving a state of understanding, of embedding oneself within the natural flow to the extent that you're part of it, like Gary talking about bioregionalism. That's the practice of indigenous mindedness is the practice of bioregionalism, but that's another way of looking at it. But if we can make our consciousness expansive enough to absorb the flow of nature, because we're part of the flow of nature. We are part of the flow of nature. We have an ancestor 3.8 billion years old that's in us right now. 355 genes from that ancestor are in us. And so that's a wholly different perspective. And what's so cool about this region is that there is real natural habitat and relative tact left to relate to with the Gila wilderness at hand, to be able to re-imbue that sense of consciousness, that indigenous consciousness in all of our heads. And so we have to do our best, and we have to stay relentless.
Would you be willing to come back and talk further about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, well, thank you so much. This has been great, yes.
I'm really blown away at all of the interconnections that you're making, that I've experienced, that I'm, that are all bouncing around and interrelating in me. You talked about wave and particle, and I studied Chinese medicine in Santa Fe, and you look at the old Chinese medical texts, and they didn't have quantum physics, they didn't have microscopes, they didn't have acceleration chambers, but they saw qi going back and forth between wave and particle, wave and particle. They knew all of that. And so many things that you've talked about touch on my perspective. And I think that even though we've been raised with a reductionist point of view, I think those of us in this room who have some level of connection with our intuition have that, we are embedded, that sense of the sacred in life, in nature, and that we get distracted, but we really can't lose that sense of we're part of this, and we love it, and we need to protect it and honor it.
Right on. I think, just as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the practice of intuition. That's something that we need to restore in ourselves. We've almost intellectualized it out of our systems, but it's there, and it can be restored if we get out in it and let nature take us back. Wow, life is good.
As you were talking, I was madly writing the authors that you were mentioning, and just to let you all know, we do have works by, of course, Edward Abbey,
Fritjof Capra.
We have his works, not the Web of Life, not the ones that you mentioned. I was surprised how many works we have by Gary Snyder and Jerry Manders.
You got Jerry.
We got Jerry, and of course we got your works. So
Wow.
please take a look at the books and feel free to purchase a copy.
Oh.
You can check out any of those books on water, the issues of water, or look up any of these other books that we have. And thank you for coming, and you don't have to go away. We stay open until 9, but some people I know do need to leave. But please, let's mingle, and I'm not ready to call it a night, but please come and take a look at what we
Thank you so much. Wow.